Greetings! My name is Kauê Neckel. I am PhD student at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul at Porto Alegre, Brazil. The following presentation is based on my master's degree dissertation defended in March of this year called Situations of Otherness, the Participation of the Other in the Formation of English People. I look forward for any comments, suggestions, and critics. I hope you enjoy.
Since 2019, when ISSES turns out into ISSEME, the perception of the other became a protagonist. A fair scenario that opens up a line of questions that calls for a generalized attitude of inclusion and empathy between academics interested in early medieval England studies. Departing from this demand, I raised a central question: in which instance the other exercised a role in the process of ethnic formation of the English peoples? As secondary questions, I ask: what were the points of convergence between the ethnic identity that he traced for his people and those who were outsourced, and how these points are useful to understand Bid's vision about the other? One of the main written sources in this process of ethnic formation of the English, Bid's Ecclesiastica Historia against Anglorum, played a central role. His centralized narrative, with an Anglocentric point of view, constructed a notion of otherness for the ethnic groups that interacted with the English peoples. They were externalized and transformed into outsiders. As other, I synthesized three main groups in which Bede prioritized in his narrative: Britons, Picts, and Irish. Therefore, this otherness is the object of my research, so I intend to investigate this perception in Bede's narrative. My main method to read otherness starts from the concept of gens Anglorum as a category of ethnicity. This category defines the two main pillars of Bede's narrative: the spread of Christianity and the idea of a single English people. Gens Anglorum works as a meta-historical and tropological discourse that magnetizes Bede's own essentialist voice in a non-essentialist context. This multiplicity of voices in a single grand narrative gives space to rethink the conception of his own situational ethnicity, being possible to read the frontiers, the margin zones between ethnic groups. Understanding the scenarios related by Bede as multi-ethnic spaces, my hypothesis goes on the way to explore the possibilities for reading ethnic plurality in this multifaceted author. This presentation is divided in two parts. First, I seek to operationalize otherness as a historiographical concept that could be applied for a Bede scenario. Then, I mean to understand how it works through the writings of Bede. Before I get my hands into Ecclesiastica Historia, I need to instrumentalize the concept of otherness that I use. My departing point is the perception of otherness as a theoretical category, which occupies an intersectional space between identity and alterity. In this point of view, otherness is a concept evolved in a dialectical movement between these two categories in Bede's discourse. While alterity is a category shrouded into an aggressive narrative against the Britons guided by differences, identity appears when Bede searches for points of convergence in a very acquiescent narrative between his gens Anglorum and the Irish and Picts. I see alterity as a category regulated by a dual opposition that need to be adapted in the plural context of otherness in Bede's gens Anglorum. Postcolonial theorists define duality as a main basis of their theories. This is the case of Homi Bhabha in The Location of Culture, Edward Said with his Orientalism, and the thesis of François Hartog, The Mirror of Herodotus. On the other hand, this category of identity must be taken cautiously. While it can be a very interesting notion to deal with ethnicity, identity needs to be appropriated into a non-essentialist context. For this utility, I employed the perspectives of Kertin Woodward's Identity and Difference to recognize that, although the discourse of Bede was very Anglocentric, the plural voice must speak louder to hear identity as a category. This plurality transforms identity into otherness when it moves in an epistemological spectrum between identity and alterity. Plurality, for me, appears as a point of convergence, between the self dimension of ethnicity in opposition to the dimension of the other. Plurality compounds my main hypothesis to examine gens Anglorum as a category not only affected by Bede's view of his own people, but also for his shadow, the other. Regarding ethnic plurality, the works of anthropologists are very useful. Marcel Detienne's Comparing the Incomparable and Frederick Barth's Ethnic Groups and Boundaries are my main bases. Departing from these two works, I see the Ecclesiastica Historia as a result of ethnic communications. Concepts such as the notion of singular plural and the idea of fluid boundaries are guiding Bede's discourse when he places the Picts and Irish, for taking an example, into a single political unity, Northumbria. This kingdom became a polyethnic unity that englobes English, Irish, Picts, and Britons, the four ethnic groups in Bede's spectrum of otherness. Over this plurality, the idea of a situational ethnicity is central in the concept of otherness. My foundation is the text's ethnic identity as a situational construct, written by the medievalist Patrick J. Geary. The situational aspect of otherness derives from hybridism as a category. Hybridism serves to see the margin zones, the in-betweenness, such as the suggestions of elementary hard text borders. Bede's gens Anglorum, as a category of discourse, has a fluid centrality in its core that incorporates the aspects and characteristics of the other. The final aspect of otherness as an instrument of analysis is the visualization of gens Anglorum through the methodological tools of the discourse analysis. My main basis is Hayden White's works, Tropics of Discourse, and Meta-History. I see gens Anglorum as a literary tropic which derives from the notion of tropos. Thus, ethnicity, in the Ecclesiastica Historia, is a category that appears as a storyline built by Bede in 731, even though he speaks about his past. The passage quoted in this presentation came from Congreve A. Minor's Bede's Ecclesiastica Historia gens Anglorum, a critical edition launched in 1979. Aiming to have a larger picture of otherness in Bede's age, I divide the analysis in two parts. First, I will show Bede's unresistant treatment for the Irish and the Picts as an other, to place these two ethnic groups in this movement of otherness. In the second part, I mean to present the erosive approach with the Britons, understanding these peoples as the dual other of Bede's discourse. In regard to the Irish and Picts, I analyze these groups conjointly on account of the fact that Bede's vision about these ethnic groups was similar. As he pointed out in the first chapter of the first book for defining the matrilineage of the Picts, the monk said, "And so the Picts went to Britain and proceeded to occupy the northern part of the island, because the Britons had seized the southern regions. As the Picts had no wives, they asked the Irish for some. They later consented to give them women, only on condition that in all the cases of doubt they should elect their kings from the female royal line rather than the male, and it is well known that the custom has been observed among the Picts to this day." Bede was aware of the matter of customs that evolved Picts and Irish and those differences from the English. Through this quoting, I assume that Bede intentionally approximated these two ethnicities in his Historia, even with awareness of their differences. Picts and Irish were central to legitimize his concept of imperium. In his famous passage recorded in the 5th chapter of the 2nd book, when he delimits the kings that obtained it, he makes a point that the integration of the other was central. The 6th to rule within the same bounds was Oswald, the most Christian king of the Northumbrians, while the 7th was his brother Oswiu, who for a time held almost the same territory. The latter overwhelmed and made tributary even the tribes of the Picts and Irish, who inhabit the northern parts of Britain. The domain over Picts and Irish and their integration inside English political units legitimized Bede's imperium. The Northumbrian kingdom is central to understand the role of otherness in the ethnic plurality transmitted by Bede. Northumbria as a space of polyethnicity, in my vision, created a conjuncture in which facilitated ethnic qualities to float between ethnic groups, making gens Anglorum a non-essentialist unity. Although the Northumbrian kings were going north since Edwin of Data in 602, the central point to understand plural unities is the figure of King Oswald. Despite Bede's respect over his figure, he elevates his Christian moral, which happened to be also a line that expressed Bede's Northumbrian identity. Placing his Christian moral in the centre, I can debate about the role of the Irish in the conversion of Northumbria. Oswald was an individual who ordered the coming of the Irish monks to the Northumbrian monastery to spread Christianity. So he sent to the Irish elders, among whom he and his thanes had received the sacrament of baptism when he was in exile. He requested them to send a bishop by whose teaching and ministry the English race, over whom he ruled, might learn the privilege of faith in our Lord and receive the sacraments. In the figures of three Irish monks that were not simultaneously in Lindisfarne until Whitby, the discourse of Bede exposed how the Irish left their mark into gens Anglorum. Even if Bede distanced himself from the Irish monks through the Easter tables, it is visible that the monk nourished esteem for Aidan, the most respected, and his successors Finan and Coleman. In this sense, there was non-essentialism in characteristics when English beliefs were forged by Irish monks, in the process of plural unities by their own presence in the main seats at Lindisfarne. Especially when Bede writes about Aidan, it is visible how the Irish were in the middle term. Bede said, "I have written these things about the character and work of Aidan, not by any means commending or praising his lack of knowledge in the matter of the observance of Easter. Such were his love of peace and charity, temperance and humility, his soul which triumphed over anger and greed, and at the same time despised pride and vainglory. But I neither praise nor approve of him in so far as he did not observe Easter at the proper time, either because he was ignorant of the canonical time or because, if he knew it, he was compelled by the force of public opinion not to follow it." Although Aidan was considered a respected monk over the preach of Christianism, a good thing for Bede gens Anglorum, he also was considered wrong about Easter, an error assigned for him by the authority of the Irish, sua gentis authoritate, not intentionally chosen by Aidan. I particularly see, at this point, that the divergences about Easter were not a matter about ecclesiastical differences, once the categories of Irish Church or English Church do not respond much, but a matter of customs connected to ethnicity and the reading of self and other. The central case of a definitive breakup with the Irish was certainly Whitby. Coleman, the third of the identified Irish monks at Lindisfarne, was addressed as the main wrongdoer in this scenario, but the Irish as an ethnic group did not escape unscathed. The Northumbrian monk said, "Coleman saw that his teachings were rejected and his principle despised. He took those who wished to follow him, that is, those who would not accept the Catholic Easter and the tonsure in the shape of a crown, for there was no small argument about these two, and returned to Ireland in order to discuss with his own party what he ought to do in the matter. Cad left the practice of the Irish and returned to his own see, having accepted the Catholic method of keeping Easter." While the ecclesiastical divergence seemed to be the central point of Bede's discourse, the origins of the monk are in the center of the speech. Bede, talking about Whitby, identified where Coleman was going after the events that broke up the presence of Irish monks between his gens Anglorum, and disposed that the central problem was the practice of the Irish, Scotorum vestigis. It is visible how the Irish were moving between a friendly discourse and a more severe one. This indefiniteness about these people is an evidence about otherness that not necessarily is responding to a space of total antagonism of authority. The education of Northumbrian kings such as Oswald was a matter of how the Irish attributes were inserted into Bede's gens Anglorum. He admits this entanglement in this passage. Oswald, who had been educated and baptized by the Irish monk and was well versed in their language, considered that nothing was better than what they had taught. King Oswald, himself occupying a Northumbrian political entity, took Irish qualities such as language and baptism, which placed him briefly in otherness. Although he was a leader of the Anglorum, he had Irish features. Over the Picts, finally, the polyethnicity domain is focused in the ecclesiastical background. Wilfrid was administering the see of the church at York, and all of the Northumbrian and Picts as far as Oswald's power extended. The administration of Wilfrid of York became a whole in Bede's narrative that included Picts not only politically by the domain of the realm, but ecclesiastically by the domain of the church. The otherness with the Picts appears in Northumbrian kingdom, in the English church and in Lindisfarne monasteries, to speak just about these three examples. Picts and Irish were integrated into Bede's Anglorum, giving English unities a very plural tone. But this integration, as Bede had consciousness, not lasted until the publication of his Historia, given the English defeat in Neckel in 685 and the ecclesiastical rupture in Whitby in 664. Over the Britons, however, the discourse was radically different. Bede fostered hatred over these groups, considering them sinners because of their non-participation in the English conversion to Christianism. Quoting Bede, "In the meantime, a virulent plague suddenly fell upon these corrupt people, which quickly laid low so large a number that were not enough people left alive to bury the dead. For this reason, a still more terrible retribution soon afterwards overtook these sinful people for their fearful crimes. As events plainly showed, this was ordained by the will of God, so that evil might fall upon those miscreants." Lending the perspective of Gilda's text, the Excidio Britanniae, which was certainly read by Bede, the Northumbrian monk propagates a discourse of antagonism for the Britons. Loaded terms like corruptae omnis, gentem peccatricem, and improbos are useful in Bede's narrative about Britons, symbolizing a clear aversion. This hostility cited the Britons as an other, in the far place of alterity, not occupying a place of otherness, which integrated peoples into his gens Anglorum. In the final moments of Ecclesiastica Historia, the Britons were again addressed in harsh words. Bede declares, "Though for the most part the Britons opposed the English through their inbred hatred, and the whole state of the Catholic Church by their incorrect Easter and their evil customs, yet being opposed by the power of God and the man alike, they cannot obtain what they want in either respect, for although they are partly their own masters, yet they have also been brought partly under rule of the English." Bede saw the necessity to delimit that part of the Brittonic people were under English rule, but they also were considered an enemy. Words like inbred hatred, odio gentem Anglorum, and evil customs, in probis impugnant, are identified in a Brittonic background. The monk not only abominated these people, but due to the frequent mentions, he wanted to make this hatred clear to his readers. Certainly, Bede did not sow these associations with innocent eyes, but the Ecclesiastica Historia also was a response of Bede's opinion about the present that he was living. English, Picts, Irish, and Britons are organized in different places in the otherness spectrum that opposes identity to alterity. While English peoples were considered his gens Anglorum, the peoples that Bede saw his belonging, the Britons were described in the side of the other, with the monk neglecting their virtues and setting them as a opposite people. The Irish and Picts in the midterm were moving through this spectrum, being sometimes a similar people that helped to spread Christianity over the English, but also were secluded when Bede rejects their custom for counting the date of Easter. These two groups were in the place of otherness, a place visualized in the ethnic plurality of Bede's context. Investigate the role of otherness in a widely known author as Bede is a step towards the reflection about the categories of the other that summarized one of the demands in the revision of the term Anglo-Saxon, an otherness which appears centrally not only in the relation established in medieval times, but in the own initiative of this work. After all, this otherness is being presented by a Brazilian historian, an other, far away from the cultural scenario and constraints of identity of England. Since this very factor, there were situations of otherness. Thank you.